It's wonderful to be here and have such a turn up for the start of this year's series. And you can see the full series. There's a little pamphlet on the seats, so you can lock it into the diaries for the year, where Troy has got us highly organised on this year. And we've got a real treat today. We're going to hear from the 2014 New South Wales Scientist of the Year, Professor Mark Westoby, who's a ARC Laureate Fellow at Macquarie University and is a distinguished professor there and leader of the Genes Geoscience Research Centre. Now, great scientists, there are many things that great scientists do, but one of the most important things is conceptualising a problem. And what has made Mark one of the, well, probably the leading ecologist in Australia, a very internationally renowned ecologist, is his ability to see the very big picture and put very interesting, unusual hypotheses in place that can be tested and provide loads of scientific activity for people working in that area, and it really challenges the accepted wisdom. And Mark has done this several times, but particularly in the trade-based plant ecology, it's been very revolutionary. And that has led to all sorts of people, whether at Macquarie or other places, learning a lot more about our ecology and how it evolves. Mark's not only, a lot of his work, of course, is not theoretical, it's been very practical and has had some very practical outcomes, including the fact that he formulated a state and transition approach, an augmented transition network for computer scientists, to managing ecosystem change, which is now mandatory throughout the rangelands in the USA. So I won't go on at great length. It's one of those stories that has endless areas to it. I should mention that Mark has won many awards and medals, both in Australia and overseas. There's so many I won't go through them. He's also very famous as a research leader and has brought along many young researchers. So there's many Mark, second generation, third, fourth, fifth generation Marks around the place. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Mark Westoby.
Thanks a lot, Mary. I'm really not sure I recognise myself at all in all of that. Thank you all very much for coming. Really appreciate it. You look so bright and intelligent, good looking at this time of the morning. Okay, let me talk first about 100 years. I picked 100 years into the future. How long's 100 years? Well, for some ecological processes, it's not a particularly long time at all. You would know, I suppose, that most Australian vegetation has a fire regime, that is, recurrent fire is part of its regular ecology. So in a tall eucalypt forest, in mountain ash forest, for example, in Victoria or Tasmania, 100 years might be an average interval between crown fires in a forest of that sort. If you were looking at populations of a rainforest tree that were migrating from one place to another, so you might get a seed dispersal jump of a few kilometres. Seedling would establish and grow up. After in the order of 50 years, it would be in the peak of producing its own seed and going on, and then there might be another jump further. So 100 years would get you 2 dispersal jumps of that sort to achieve spatial movement of a rainforest tree population. 100 years is quite a long time for human processes. It's 4 human generations, near enough. It is, as far as I understand politics, about 33 federal governments, presumably of different flavours as time went by, which probably helps you to understand why ecologists like me anyway tend to sort of see politics in terms of changes over 20 or 30 years rather than week by week. Look, I should put up a couple of disclaimers. The first is, I guess, the bleeding obvious, that predictions about the future aren't certain in the way that scientists ordinarily try to deal with certainty of a repeatable process on the lab bench or in the glasshouse. But we'll try to work out what's likely to happen in the future as scientists, as economists, as insurance actuaries, I suppose. And the important thing, I guess, is I'll try to explain to you why I think what I think, and then you can make your own minds up. The other thing I should say is that I'm not actually a specialist in the ecology of climate change. I did think about talking to you about the work in my own lab, but decided it was a bit esoteric to be of interest to you. So briefly, a reasonably likely situation in 2115, and by reasonably likely I mean better than evens, is that Australia, well the world really, will be 5 or 7 degrees C warmer. The atmosphere will be running at maybe 1,000 or so parts per million of CO2 as compared to the 400 that we have currently. We've just passed through 400 on the way up. And there will be maybe 80 million or so humans in Australia as compared to 24 million or so currently. Here is the brief summary of why the warming is happening. So on the main part of this graph there are, as you can see, blue scenarios and red scenarios. The blue scenarios are the ones that are designed so that warming remains below about 2 degrees C of warming compared to late 1800s. And for that to happen, what the world has to do for that to happen is summarised in the inset graph in the upper left, which is CO2 emissions from worldwide from burning fossil fuel. And the two lines separate starting in 2115. And you can see that to stay below 2 degrees C, we basically have to start reducing worldwide emissions of CO2 now and halve them roughly by 2040 and keep on going downwards. The zero line is actually one notch up in that graph. So they're near zero by the end of the century. In contrast to that, what's known as business as usual usually continues growth, less than exponential in fact, but nevertheless continued growth in CO2 emissions, and leads, as the red line indicates, to about 5 degrees C of warming by 2100, a bit more than that by the 2115 that I'm talking about. So what I'm saying in effect is that I think the likeliest outcome is business as usual. And I've got two sorts of reasons for expecting that. One is simply that that's what's happening and has continued to happen for quite a while. So these are graphs of sort of possible forward scenarios for CO2 emissions, CO2 emissions, not concentrations in the atmosphere. The various sort of coloured, dashed and solid lines are forward scenarios starting in 2000. The black dots are the actual outcome. And the point you have to appreciate is that the science of global warming was basically pretty well understood by the 80s. Well, arguably it was well understood before that. But during the 1980s, for the first time, the international research community decided this was important enough, it should really start a process, got an international, so-called Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change process together to sort out amongst thousands of scientists worldwide what the consensus was, what we knew with high confidence, what we knew with less confidence, and importantly to package all that in forms that governments and other sorts of decision makers were accustomed to understand. So the IPCC process was actually triggered by sort of senior civil servants who sort of dictated how things should be phrased. And the first cycle of that happened during the 1980s. The first assessment report was at the end of the 1990s, and there have been 5 iterations of that, subsequently updating the science and strengthening it in some cases, but not really changing the fundamentals. So the whole situation has sort of been clearly spelled out, at least since the 1980s. But that hasn't changed the actual upward trajectory of CO2 emissions, as you can see. And also, as you would be aware, there's been lots of attempts at international agreements, treaties of various kinds. They haven't made much of a dent on the upward rise. So that's one sort of reason to expect business as usual, just the empirical one. That's what's actually happening. The other sort of reason is that really, for something other than business as usual to happen, it's possible, of course, but it's pushing against really strong tendencies in human behaviour. Essentially, nations have to agree to wind back fossil fuel use before they can be sure whether others will do so also. It's a very traditional problem in ethics, you know, do I do the right thing before I'm sure everyone else is going to? And it's hard to make it stick, even if you had a world government, which we don't, it would probably be hard to make it stick. Another way to look at it is that precepts, ideas, and philosophical principles that are put up very commonly are about sustainability over time and about equity between generations. And it's easy to put those up as objectives, but you need to understand that they are actually in conflict with major tendencies in human behaviour. So, you know, human behaviour uses time discounting. That is, it values outcomes in the near future more highly than outcomes in the distant future. That's not just a freak of bank managers or something that does that. That's embedded in all kinds of decisions, not just in financial discounting. Indeed, it's embedded in the decisions by animals, and it's quite easy to see why there's been natural selection for it going back 600 million years. So there are very, don't misunderstand me here. I strongly believe we should stop burning fossil fuels, and I would very much like to hope that the world will get its act together to achieve that. But to be blunt, I'm pessimistic that it will. Okay, so what does 5 to 7 degrees C of warming mean? This is a temperature map of Australia. Essentially, it's winter maximum temperatures, I believe, but it would be much the same for other temperature indices. And the point to notice about it is that the colour bands are about 3 degrees C wide. So a 6 degrees C warming represents 2 of these colour bands. Very roughly, it represents about a third the depth of Australia. It represents taking the climate of Rockhampton and moving it to Sydney, climate of Sydney and moving it to Hobart in that order. If you look at this is not quite an agriculture map of Australia, but it's quite agroecological regions defined by all kinds of things, but basically a different agroecological region will favour growing a different crop in a different manner. And you can see that in most cases 5 to 7 degrees C will bump you out of one agroecological region into another, if you imagine sort of sliding those zones southward across Australia. Similarly, for species in natural vegetation, these are data for eucalypts. As you probably know, there's about 800 species of eucalypts in Australia. And what this graph indicates is the fraction of those species, or percentage of those species, that have present-day climate envelopes narrower than something 1 degree, 2 degrees, 3 degrees across the bottom. So about 80% of all species have present-day distributions narrower than 6 degrees. That is to say, if you warm the place by 6 degrees, then their present climate envelope will be completely displaced from their present geographical distribution, and something will have to happen. So far I've just talked about temperature, so let me say a bit at pretty much high school level about rainfall and so forth. So this is the sort of standard diagram of how the main circulation of the atmosphere works, and you start from the point that most radiant energy from the sun, the largest warming of the surface of the Earth by radiant energy from the sun happens at the equator. That's the strongest driver of it all, and warms the air near to the ground at the equator, and that warm, moist air rises at that point, and sheds lots of rainfall, so you have a high rainfall zone sort of right along the equator, and then the air spreads out north and south, and it's dry by this time, and comes back to ground level again in the order of 30 degrees north or south. Hence the broad bands of relatively low rainfall, 30 degrees north and south, in the Earth's geography. The point is that as you intensify the greenhouse effect with more CO2 in the atmosphere, you're basically driving those pumps harder. You're intensifying rainfall and you're also intensifying evaporation. The difference between the two accentuates. Wet places get wetter, dry places get drier, and over time the reach of this first cell outwards further away from the equator gets stronger, so the zones shift more towards the poles. I should say a bit also about, so far I've just talked about elevated CO2 as it affects the climate, but CO2 is actually a resource for plant growth also, as I'm sure you've heard. Basically plants exchange water for CO2, so they have small pores in the leaf, gaseous CO2 enters through those, gets absorbed into the wet surface of cells, and then goes on from there into the biochemistry of photosynthesis, gets turned into sugars, gets built into more plant parts, runs the metabolism of the plants, and so forth. But the other side of that coin, unavoidable, is that meanwhile water is evaporating off the surface of those wet cells and water vapour is going outwards through the stomata and so forth, and that's why plants use so much water, much more than they actually need at what point in time in their bodies, because it's flowing through as part of the exchange for CO2. So if you increase the external CO2 concentration, then basically a plant gets more CO2 uptake for a given amount of use of water, so it can either use less water, close down its stomata a little bit for the same amount of photosynthesis, or it can accomplish more photosynthesis for the same amount of water. That's what I mean by saying that in the large, elevated CO2 has effects similar to giving a plant higher rainfall. So in a word then, a greenhouse Australia will be more tropical. The machinery of ecosystems will be running faster, be warmer, faster water cycle, rainfall zones shifted south a bit, plus the effects of higher CO2, generally higher intake of energy into ecosystems. Before you get the idea that makes it all just lovely, it's worth remembering that more tropical is not sort of entirely more comfortable for human life, or for plant life or crops or things like that. It includes acceleration of insect herbivores, acceleration of the multiplication rate of fungal pathogens on crops, lots of mosquitoes and the diseases they transmit between us and other vertebrates, things like that. So similarly for agricultural ecosystems, generally I would say that agricultural productivity should be at least as high as it is currently, but it'll need to be different crops in different places. So the take-home message, I suppose, from what I've said so far is basically that if anything, expect overall biological production in Australia to be higher than now, but it'll be relocated. Most crops and wild species populations will need to be somewhere other than their current distributions, if they're still viable at all, of course, for any particular crop. So that was all talking about ecosystems as a sort of a machine that processes energy and nutrients and so forth. So now let me turn to talking about ecosystems as a collection of species sort of distributed geographically. My best guess is that with zones shifting southward on the scale of 5, 6, 7 degrees, maybe half or more of all Australian species will be lost 100 years from now. For a lot of them, appropriate habitat simply won't be available anymore. The ones along the sort of southern edge of the continent and the ones near mountain tops, of course, there simply won't be habitat like that anymore. Even where there is viable habitat somewhere, the transition from the present situation to a redistribution geographically will be quite complicated and difficult. Does species loss matter in general or on that scale? I think it does. The main reason I'd put forward for that is essentially that species are heritage. They encapsulate history and a lot of it. So in the fossil record, typical durations of species in the fossil record are 1 or 2 million years. So if we take 1 million years as a sort of typical species lifetime for the sake of a back-of-the-envelope calculation, that means that each present-day species has this history of 1 million years long, separate from its nearest sister species. And then, of course, the ancestor of those two species has a deeper history behind that and so forth, but just looking at the most recent branch. Now, 1 million years is 200 times longer than the age of the pyramids in Egypt, which we would all regard as heritage and think it was a loss if they were lost, right? What has the species got in it that is sort of cultural value that we're interested in keeping? Well, we know in principle that it's got coded in it the solutions to problems, because that's what natural selection does. It creates genetic variants all the time, and the genetic variants that are more successful at solving the problems of staying alive and having offspring become predominant in the population. We know that's how it works. So we know that in principle that each of these species has got the solution to some sort of problem in it. In hardly any case do we know what problem exactly or how the solution has been solved, but we sort of know that that's what they are. The solutions are written in the DNA. I've noticed that in recent years it's become common for political parties to say something is in their DNA, and corporations and so forth, and they don't really quite mean that. But for species it actually is written in their DNA. Yes, for hardly any of these do we know very much about exactly what problem. We just know that in principle they've solved problems. As you may have noticed in a table in an earlier graph, actually only about 1/4 of Australian species have been described in the sense of a formal description written down, and so if you're holding a specimen in your hand you can in principle work out what it is. Let me say a bit about some of the complexities of transitions from one location to another. What happens when you take temperature zonation and sort of slide it towards the poles? Sorry about this cartoon summary. So we have here a gradient from poleward or cooler environment to equatorward or warmer environment with a temperature scale on the bottom, and two species which I'll call green and blue for brevity. So then we slide the temperature scale a couple of degrees to the left towards the poles. So one possible outcome is that the green species is killed by higher temperature and the blue species occupies the resulting space. I said killed for brevity. More formally, its rate of replacement falls below 1. In a population sense, might be lower seedling survival, might be actual death of adults, might be less successful production of seeds, less successful pollination, or like combinations of all of those things which together brought it down below replacement, but killed for short. Here's a second outcome. Actually, it's the same outcome, but with a different mechanism. So under this scenario, the green species could perfectly well stay in its previous geographical location, where the sort of slightly pink call-out indicates, but actually the blue species outcompetes it as it comes in. So it's getting pushed out by competition rather than by being knocked off by the higher temperature directly. Now, in the two cases I've shown so far, those two outcomes look the same, but if you think about it for a minute, you can see that the two mechanisms start to make a difference when dispersal is restricted or slow. So here's an outcome where the green species is killed by the raised temperatures, but the blue species is not dispersing, at least not quickly, into the resulting space, and essentially you get vacant ground in the middle. Don't suppose it would be totally vacant. It'd be something that grew fast enough and energetically enough to take it over, but amongst the two species we're talking about. Or a different sort of outcome where the green species tolerates the warming and the blue either can't disperse or can't invade. So the boundary actually stays geographically where it was before, but at a different temperature from where it was before. The two boundaries, because there's actually a warm boundary of green and a cool boundary of blue involved. This particular outcome maybe poses a particular sort of challenge. One of the things you should realise is that most of the species in the world are arthropods, insects or mites, or fungi, about 90% or so in total. And the food webs that support all those species are quite often specialised on particular host plant species. Indeed, that's why there's such a lot of species of arthropods and mites, because they're specialised on host plants to various degrees. So if you get an outcome like outcome 3, where climate envelopes are somewhat dissociated from host plants, what's going to happen to those residents? Will they be okay with different host plants provided that they've got the right climate? Will they be okay with different climates provided they've got the right host plant? Or are they going to absolutely need the combination of the two, in which case, under this scenario, they'll be out of luck? So just those are sort of 3 scenarios to give you a sense of the complexities of the possible transitions as species move across landscapes. Unfortunately, we have very little hard evidence about which of these scenarios applies more often, how the mechanism works. We understand fairly well in principle how to get that evidence. You need to do what's called a transplant experiment, indicated here. So you pick up the green species, presumably as tube stock or seedlings, and you move them to an environment which is currently a couple of degrees warmer, and plant them in there and see how they go. In the first place, with the temperature, and probably with and without competition from the blue species. Sounds easy to say in the abstract, but very few such experiments have been done. It's completely understandable why. It's very hard work, needs to be replicated quite a lot. It's very hard to get permissions. National parks would not be enthusiastic about transplanting things that they saw as weeds from one place to another before they had already migrated. And on the standard research funding cycle of maybe a 3-year grant, you just get to follow it through seedling survivorship and initial growth, so you wouldn't get to follow through the whole life cycle of a perennial plant, which is what ideally you'd need to work out whether the population was going to make it out of sight. So it's kind of easy to describe in principle, but very hard to actually do on a large scale. Anyway, the take-home message, I suppose, is simply that dispersal of species is going to become a big factor. There's going to be a lot of times too little dispersal by species that we would rather like to see relocate, and other times there's going to be a lot too much dispersal by species that we don't really want to take over the whole continent. Overall, we expect native vegetation to become much more weedy. By that I don't necessarily mean exotic species from beyond Australia, but a shift in the mixture of life histories. Generally, a world with moving climate zones will favour species that produce seeds early and in large numbers, and it'll disadvantage the reverse. And we expect to see that sort of shift in the species composition, as well as some continued homogenisation with the rest of the world. Final point I'd like to make to you is about monitoring. You know that you're all familiar with the weather station network we have, rainfall tubes and temperature gauges and so forth, all gathered together by Bureau of Met. So we have rational bodies of data running back more than 100 years in most parts of the continent as to what some basic elements of the weather have been like. It's a great thing. It's really hard to imagine having a sensible discussion about climate change, for example, if we didn't have that sort of backdrop of reliable data about the way the world is and whether it's changed. And seemingly there is sort of bipartisan consensus that it's an essential thing to do. At least I haven't heard of either party offering to close down the weather station network in order to save a bit of dough. But I'm sorry to say that there basically doesn't exist any equivalent for the way ecosystems are. I don't mean there's no monitoring happening at all, but there's no consistent, sustained, nationwide network, and there's no sort of consensus that it needs to be kept going over 100 years or more. I personally feel this is really important for people to feel they belong in a landscape, in a country. They need to understand the history of that landscape and to feel they own it in that sense. I think that our descendants 100 years from now will see us as having failed if we don't leave them a reasonable objective record of ecosystem change over time. Okay, so just to recap briefly the main points to leave you with, I suppose. I think warming by 5 to 7 degrees C 100 years from now is likely. It's pretty unlikely to stop at 2 degrees C. Generally, the effect on the machinery of ecosystems will be to sort of speed it up, although not at every location. There will be some locations where rainfall has decreased and things like that. And the consequence of that scale of temperature change will basically be to relocate almost everything or kill it. And by almost everything, I mean species in the wild and also biologically based activities, or at least outdoor biologically based activities. I suppose I should leave biotech out of this. And to very much impoverish our biological heritage in the form of species richness. Really appreciate your patience. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Mark, and thank you for that very clear explanation of the science. I'm going to start the questions by asking what would be the equivalent of the climate activities of the Bureau of Met in terms of plant and species, but particularly plants. What should we be doing? What should we be collecting? What form should that entity take?
Let me answer that at two levels. One of the reasons why such a thing doesn't exist is that, of course, every scientist you talk to puts up a different thing they would like to have measured, and that is our problem, and we ought to try to sort it out internally. I have personal preferences for really simple things. I think that the perennial species that provide structural habitat for everything else are the crux of this, and so I would have lots and lots of plots visited by a boots-on-the-ground botanist, but not necessarily very often. Like, right. So like month to month, year to year change, yeah. We have other research structures for doing that. You can investigate that within a 3-year grant. What we're talking about here is change over decades. So I would much rather have sort of thousands of plots that someone visited every 10 years than intensive
and which we could automate
plots.
Anyway. Yeah.
We could try to automate. We could try to get citizen involvement with simply photo points are actually.
And of course, citizen involvement's been the big success of the Bureau of Met.
Yes.
Yes, which is how the climate record of Australia is so good compared to other.
The other point I'd make about it, and that's just my personal view about what I would go measure, is that I think it needs to be seen as a monitoring operation, not as a research operation.
Sure.
Research operations change their mind about what the question is, every 10 years, and so they should. That's the nature of research. So it has really been a problem that this monitoring issue has gotten tangled up with people who want funding for long-term research. So, again, like the Bureau of Met. I think we need to sort of break out of that and say, no, this is just sort of monitoring for the general good. Of course, someone may use the data in research somewhere down the track, but it's not a research activity. It's done by technicians or by the public in some form. And that's what's the word, sort of an institutional reframe that we need around this problem.
Other questions?
Thanks for the talk. Is there any efforts or any discussion being made about actually biobanking these species for future understanding? You talked about, you know, the genetic code that they contain, sequencing, that sort of thing.
Yes, there certainly is discussion. There isn't, to the best of my knowledge, a particularly organised program in Australia. There are, you've probably seen TV programs about, there's an ice cave in, is it Spitsbergen, with very large numbers of seeds in, and so forth. So there are programs to different extents in different places. To go to the broader implication of your question, you would understand that from an ecologist's point of view, it's not very emotionally satisfactory to think about conserving species by stuffing them in a freezer rather than by keeping them going in the wild. But I think that the setting aside the emotional of it, as I said, to me, the key to the value of species is in their DNA, and yes, it would be better than nothing to keep them in a freezer. It is something we should probably try to get better organised about.
Your advice is that 5 to 7 degrees is fait accompli. This is totally dependent upon soil, and soil we're running out of. I lead a program the last 7 to 8 years with the China government, FAO, the UN. We're growing soil, food and vegetation in deserts that sequester 40 tonnes CO2 per hectare per annum, will live for more than 100 years. So we are endeavouring, we are in fact, reversing climate change back to a normal position. Does the university and your good self entertain applying the science to reverse CO2?
So the first thing to say, probably, especially since my DVC for research is here, is don't take it out of the university. This is my opinion as an individual. There are, as you would know, a variety of programs, one of which you've just mentioned, for storing CO2 in different ways. 2 to 4%
of Earth's vegetation, only 2 to 4%.
Okay. I'm not working on them personally. As I say, I'm not even working on climate change research personally. Lots of people are in lots of places. I do not see any sign yet that they're at a scale that even remotely begins to offset the rate at which we're burning fossil fuels.
Far corner, Troy. No, right down the back. And then Troy, beside you.
Yes, good morning. Thanks very much for that presentation. My name's Roger Woodward and I'm a tax practitioner. Which countries in the Northern Hemisphere would actually benefit from climate change? And as someone who's also a volunteer firefighter, we've got about 70,000 members, and it'd be a good idea to have a chat to the Commissioner, because there's a heck of a lot of botanists that if you tell us what you need, we'll at least provide you with some data. Thanks.
Okay, 2 things in there. It's interesting what you said about the Northern Hemisphere. Actually, the very first forecast of the effects of rising CO2 were made by a famous Swedish chemist by the name of Arrhenius at the end of the 1800s, and actually got the calculation about right, although it was very back of the envelope-ish. But he thought it would be a great thing for Sweden. Sweden, you know, all that snow would go away, and it would become rich cereal crops, and Sweden would become a great power as good as France, if not better. I guess it depends what you think is a benefit to a nation. There are lots of things happening in Russia, in Canada, in the northern US, which are, in some sense, aggressively taking advantage of the opening up of the north.
What do you mean, like shipping lines and things?
Mm-hmm. Shipping lines. Actually, someone, this may be an apocryphal story, but I heard somewhere that there's actually there's a number of people in the US government, of course, working on climate change and the shrinking of the ice cap over the Arctic Oceans and things like that. But I heard somewhere that there were a lot more people in the US government working on the capacity to drill for oil under where the ice cap currently is once that opportunity becomes available.
Which is, of course, it's happening in the Nordics too. We're going.
Yes, there are, as I guess I was hinting at in other contexts, in terms of economic activity, there are arguably benefits of a variety of kind, and then there are downsides in terms of scrubbing our biological and evolutionary history.
John Welsh is my name. Thank you for your presentation. In light of your comment about the doubling of the population in Australia in the next 100 years, the world population therefore would increase roughly, from 8 billion to 16 odd billion. And in light of your comments relating to the photosynthesis, where you only mentioned the water balance rather than the oxygen production, have you any comments about whether or not you feel that the influence that you believe to be with CO2 is likely to occur? Because we need the oxygen.
On the scale that we're talking about, the impact of photosynthesis on oxygen in the atmosphere is very small. So the atmosphere is running at 20% odd oxygen, whereas CO2 is well under 1%. So you know, a doubling of CO2 only represents quite small changes in oxygen amounts. It's not really the rate, but the net shift from being in the atmosphere to being fixed in some form that drives the oxygen balance. I don't think oxygen supply is remotely endangered by accelerated photosynthesis. I'm very sorry, there was something else, but it slipped.
The fact that we need the oxygen with an increasing population of the world of that magnitude, which is massive, and we are not increasing the foliage, the green foliage that produces the oxygen. We're a limited surface area, and unless you increase that, you will not be able to compensate, because human beings are producing their 4% CO2. That's going on, and if you believe climate change is the main driver of CO2, you need to be able to compensate that by using the oxygen through the production of green foliage. That's the point.
Yeah. Okay. So accelerated photosynthesis due to increased CO2 in the atmosphere, as I said, makes a barely detectable difference to atmospheric oxygen concentration, and that's in any case is not a limiting thing for human populations. Coming back to human populations, so Australia has one of the fastest growing ones in the Western world, and has done for quite a long time, and that is principally because of immigration, both the direct effect of people arriving, plus also people arriving tend to aspire to larger family sizes than people who've been here previously. Those two effects together account for the relatively high sustained population growth. Of course, each of us will read Australian politics our own way, but I don't foresee enthusiasm for immigration stopping anytime soon in Australia. That's a little bit disconnected from the question of the population of the rest of the world, which is mostly is currently 8 billion or thereabouts, and is projected by the standard United Nations and so forth forecast to level out in the order of 11 or 12 billion on the basis of the quote, demographic transition, improved education, especially for women, dropping family sizes. Now, of course, it's a matter of opinion whether and how much that will happen, but it won't simply mirror what happens to the Australian population, I don't believe.
Martin, and then Chris, and we'd probably wrap up that.
Thank you, Marcus. Superb talk. My name is Martin Thomas, the Academy of Technological Sciences. Would you have any comment on the ecological changes in the ocean arising from enhanced acidification, as I believe is happening? Thank you.
Yes, so you understand absorption of CO2 into the ocean has the very particular effect of pulling down the pH a bit, as you alluded to. I really don't, not my field. I only know what I've read, which is which is a bit. So there are 2 points of view about it. One is that it's two extremes of view anyway. One is that it's a very high-risk situation, so that lots of organisms in the ocean depend on, say, for calcification to form, for example, coral skeletons or the shells of mollusks or things of that sort. And that process will be endangered, or at least the products will become more fragile, I mean literally mechanically fragile. Large parts of ocean food webs will basically fall apart, is kind of version 1. Version 2 is, well, we have had much higher CO2 levels in the distant geological past, if you go back before 30 million years ago, mollusks were operating then, and so forth. And so there are larger biogeochemical processes which will counteract that. As I understand it, the argument revolves around the question, well, how fast are those larger biogeochemical processes going to operate? And you have now totally come to the rim of what I know about it. Sorry.
At that point, we should actually... Did you want to comment on that, Hugh, or was it Chris's turn next? Let Chris... We might just have time to let Hugh ask a question.
Chris Fell, an excellent talk, thank you very much. A little while ago we heard a talk on synthetic biology. As I was listening to your talk, I thought to myself synthetic evolution might be on the agenda. And I wondered to what extent, since we're into genomes and we shove things in and make them behave differently, should we have a major research effort in Australia in adapting our food for approaching weekly temperature change, and not doing it in 100 years, but doing it in 20 years. I don't want talking for the countryside and win the world in our skills. Would you care to comment?
Could we do it within 20 years, not 100 years?
I'd love to comment. This wasn't actually a setup for me to talk to about it. There's a lot of interesting things in there. Some things can, as you say, potentially be evolved fairly fast. I'm not sure synthetic biology is the crux of it. We've been doing plant breeding and animal breeding in one way or the other for a long time. Yeah, it depends. Most of the ecological fundamentals that I tried to talk about are trade-offs that are locked in by the physical situation. So, the fact that, to take one example that I talked about, that CO2 involves water going out, that is not evadable by breeding or by changing the genes. So there are some things you can breed for and other things which are potentially basic constraints that you have to work with. It's like an engineering situation, I suppose, in that sense. It is very strongly my belief that synthetic biology is really interesting in the sense that you could find out all kinds of things about genomes by sort of correlative investigation and by taking things apart and measuring them. But as I'm sure engineers in the audience are familiar with, it's when you actually try to build it and make it work that you find all kinds of things that you hadn't previously realised. So in that sense, lab synthetic biology is going to be a really exciting area of development. But for me as an ecologist, there is a sort of a parallel area to it, which is an equally interesting set of opportunities, that you can build things that work in a vat in monoculture. That's one thing. But then making them competitive in a mixed environment with potential weeds jumping in and so forth, that's another proposition. So most of synthetic biology naturally will be focused on very controlled situations. But for us, I think there's a distinct sort of strand of research opportunity in trying to work out what you would need to do to make synthesized organisms field competitive.
Do you want to comment, Saki?
I'm satisfied with it.
You're satisfied with that? That's good. They've got to sort of work together. Hugh, you can have the last question as long as it's quick.
Yeah, well, I guess it follows from that in some sense. I'm interested in the dynamics. Everything you showed is very smooth trajectories and everything else, and yet I envisage that there may even be some tipping point in the kinds of models that you have been producing that would suggest some sudden change. Can you just comment on that?
Yes, absolutely. So, as you say, I just went with the simplest projections, which are basically forward projections of what's happening now. The climate system and ecological systems as well has lots of both positive and negative feedbacks in. My own sense of the situation is that the potential for the positive feedbacks look more likely than the negative feedbacks. So that, to take a simple example of a positive feedback, as you reduce ice caps over the Arctic, for example, the ice cap is much more reflective, bounces much more radiation back into space than does the relatively black water underneath it. So basically you get more energy absorbed into the Earth system as you reduce ice caps. And the most conspicuous ones of those kinds look to me like positive feedback. So I would say the risks are mostly on the high side. This whole question of tipping points is much discussed. There's been a string of papers from the Resilience Alliance and other places over the last 10 years trying to list the main tipping points in the Earth system and assess each of them, try to size up how close we are to each of them and so forth. That's a whole long discussion.
Good. Well, with that, and thank you, that's a great question to end on, Hugh. Yes, we should have breakfast and things. Thank you very much, Mark. It's something to get us thinking, to start us thinking for the year on this, and we're going to hear a bit more on climate issues because we're going to have Andy Pittman, the head of the Climate Change Centre of Excellence, I think speaking next, isn't it, Troy? But this is, I'm sure, one of those ones that we find that people who are accidentally in the lifts after these will find lots and lots of conversations going on. It's really good for getting us thinking and reflecting the sort of science thinking that we do a lot of in New South Wales. So on behalf of all of us, Mark, here's as they say, a small token of our appreciation. Hope we got it right. Look forward to seeing the rest of you in hopefully April, and it's great to see old faces, but there's some new faces here too, and that's great. I did the advertising for the seminars before, and of course it's April the 15th for the next one with Andy Pittman that I just mentioned that. And Troy's asked me to mention something else, do another bit of advertising for a new website called SciMex, the Science Media Exchange. And that is going to be a sort of direct exchange thing that's sponsored by the Australian Science Media Centre, AusMC, that the New South Wales Government is a firm supporter of in terms of funding and so on. But this is a website across Australia and New Zealand that allows journalists and scientists to connect directly, where scientists can pitch their story and journalists can pitch it up directly. Any other aspects to it, Troy? He's our OSMC board member.
It's basically providing breaking science news from universities, individual researchers, institutes, directly to the journos. It allows science communicators to pitch themselves as spokespeople on the issues that are breaking, news stories that are breaking, and it'll be a great opportunity for people to connect directly with the media and get their stories out there.
Sort of OSMC sort of doing itself out of a job, but we'll keep funding it. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, see you in April. Great to see you this morning.